Welcome to Artist the Critic. I'm Don Gray. I think today we have an interesting discussion because it involves opposing currents in art, perhaps. We'll find out in just a moment. Two of our guests are Bill Rabinovich and Elizabeth Converse, who are artist initiators, two of the three artist initiators of the Counterweight exhibition in Soho in 4 or 5 galleries down there. And our third guest is Philip Sherrod, man I consider one of the major artists of our time, and we have Phil's comments on the Counterweight show as well as the Whitney Museum. Bill or Elizabeth, what is being counterweighted, and what is the Counterweight show?
You want to start off, Elizabeth?
Well, the Counterweight show has been described as an artist-initiated, museum-scale, artistic exhibition of visual arts and performing arts, offering an artistic dialogue with the Whitney Biennial. That was our first definition of it.
Are you reflecting the values of the Whitney, or are you trying to reflect differing values? Are you trying to offer an alternative, or what is your...
We're trying to offer not only an alternative, but an enhancement and a new perspective on showing art publicly.
Bill, what you're thinking on that?
Well, I agree with what Elizabeth said. We also, because this is the year of the Whitney Biennial, which is on now, we recognize that there were certain things that we disagreed with, and we decided in the end of December, first part of January, that we would organize a response, sort of a kind of a protest show initially to the Whitney Biennial. As it turned out, I think we were justified in initiating the show because of the tremendous amount of energy that hundreds or perhaps even up to 1,000 people now have associated themselves with the Counterweight show for one reason or another.
Precisely what is it, though, about the Whitney that you are trying to not oppose, perhaps, or not necessarily oppose, but trying to offer a diverse viewpoint from? I mean, what is there about the Whitney, the show this year, for example, or in the past?
Well, in this particular show, they're showing some 45 artists, American artists. And most of the artists that they're showing this year already have a great deal of exposure in the gallery system. In fact, about 50% of them come from about 6 different galleries in New York. And now the show, the Whitney Biennial, was originally conceived of to show vital new work that had not had sufficient exposure in the art world. So to us that seemed like quite a problem as to the possibility, first of all, of unknown artists to get into the Whitney seemed to be very minimal kind of chance. So then by initiating this particular exhibition, we offered the chance for many other artists, thousands of other artists, to submit work to us for review, and then we had a jury and so forth and so on so that their work could be shown. The second aspect is the particular aesthetic range of work that's shown at the Whitney this year is more on the conceptual, minimal way of thinking that has been exposed in the galleries the last few years, whereas although we represent artists in the show who represent that point of view somewhat, we are trying to take a much broader aesthetic viewpoint into account.
So you're talking about artistic freedom and opposing an artistic bureaucracy in a sense that deals only with establishment figures and establishment procedures and so forth.
Yes.
Is that more or less what you're saying?
Yes, there's a limit to which museums can take risks, and the concept of the show is so important that we felt that the museum, the Whitney this year, has failed to take the necessary risk to put on a vital enough show.
Okay, just a moment so perhaps we can introduce some of Phil's, Sherrod's thinking. Phil, did you have any comments at this point in terms of your assessment of the Whitney or the work that you saw in the Counterweight exhibition, or would you prefer to sit a moment and we continue?
I'd rather wait.
Yeah, okay. So you're saying that, what are the qualities then in the Counterweight show, would you say, Bill? You say that it's essentially conceptual and minimal at the Whitney. What are the qualities
Well,
that you would say?
there are two basic areas where the differences lay in. One is the aesthetic area, and the other is the political area. Now, for example, at the Whitney, there are still very, very few women in the show that they have. Now, we looked at the work of thousands of people, and we weren't able to tell in the initial selection of the work who did what. We looked at the slides without name. And what it came out to be was about 50% women in the show, 50% men, not as a grid overlay that was established beforehand, but just sheerly on the basis of the quality of the work. The Whitney show runs somewhere around 23% women, and I think that's about as high as it's ever been. That was one question. Then there was the question of the ethnic artists who were in the show. I think there was perhaps one black artist that showed in the Whitney biennial this year. And we tried our best to get slides from a whole variety of Latin artists and black artists from all different sources around the United States. And it so happened, without the names being on the work or anything, that when the slides went through, many of those people turned up in the show, finally.
Who did select the show? What was the selection
Elizabeth?
process?
Yeah, this show was selected by a jury of 7 people. And that jury of 7 people was selected by an executive committee of 6 people. That executive committee represented both minority factors and women and men equally.
Were they artists, or were the
They
gallery
were all
directors,
artists.
or what?
Well,
On the executive committee, there was one person who was not an artist, and all of the people who selected the show were artists.
And
what do you want us to give the names of the selectors?
if you'd like to, sure. If you'd like to, go ahead, Bill.
Well, the executive committee, the initial people were Barnaby Rue, who is not here today, Elizabeth Converse, and myself. And then we expanded the executive committee to include Gilbert Coker, Mario Cesar Romero, Nitza Tofino de Brightman. These 6 people then chose a selection committee of 7 people. The selection committee for this year is Betsy Damon, Peter Roof, Laura Marquez, Vernita Nemec, Randy Williams, myself, Nitza Tofino de Brightman.
Now, I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not familiar with any of these names. And are they showing with particular galleries in New York City, or what is their situation? Are they independent artists, or how would you describe them?
They're mostly independent artists, but there are several of them, many of them have shown in galleries in various places.
Are they with a particular gallery at the moment? I mean, could you associate some of those names with galleries, or is that possible?
Yes. Betsy,
Randy Williams is with just above Midtown Gallery.
that's correct. And let's see, Vernita Nemec is with the Soho 20
Is that a cooperative gallery?
It's a cooperative gallery of the women artists. And
Betsy Damon is with
14 Sculptors.
14 Sculptors.
Gallery. Let's see, I'm with the Rabinovich and Guerra Gallery, where I have been for many years. And one of the other people shows with the Cayman Gallery.
Nitza Tofino de Brightman. And Peter Roof, I believe, has shows with galleries in Washington and Texas.
And the Dreyfus Parson Gallery.
Okay, the reason I ask this because I'm sort of interested in their artistic point of view. I really wonder, are you serious in saying that questions like ethnic origin and sex and whatever other political or social aspects, they were secondary to aesthetic quality?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. The aesthetic quality was the primary emphasis of how we looked at the slides. And then it was only later on that these other things were kind of looked at and examined in the sort of the last stage of the selection process, so we could see where we were.
More specifically, we were faced with these particular political issues before the selection process occurred. However, and we dealt with them on the executive level, and we dealt with them also in the selection committee by bringing in artists that represented
Were sympathetic to those views, or?
Well, we brought in artists from minority groups, and we had an adequate representation of women on the selection committee. But, so we dealt with it structurally, but when we judged the work itself, the slides, the aesthetics were what were important.
Okay, I'll tell you the reason I asked this. I am basing my thoughts on a quick 2-hour tour of Soho and the Whitney. And to be perfectly honest, I really wasn't too impressed with the quality at either place. In my opinion, I feel that one of the main problems with the art of our time is that it is basically aesthetically oriented, materials oriented, and it really has nothing to do with statements of the human condition or the human spirit or all of the qualities that have made art great in the past. So what I'm saying is that I felt the Whitney was like an icebox. It was cold and impersonal, as you mentioned, because of the minimal and conceptual conception of the show.
Right.
But I felt that same abstract dominance, that same play on the abstract quality of materials and aesthetics in the Counterweight show, although there was a difference in that it had a slightly funkier feeling, if you want to say that, a slightly, okay, I'm groping for a word. I'll say funky at the moment, and then you can discuss that. So then my personal feeling was that neither show probed to the heart of the issue of contemporary art, which is that, in my opinion, we're in a terribly impoverished artistic era. I believe we're working in a time of artistic decline and decadence.
Yes.
And I just didn't see the Counterweight show searching for alternatives.
Well, here was one of the main points. We easily could have put a Counterweight show on that would have taken a single point of view, and could have been a gutsy kind of figurative expressionist work. We certainly had enough artists to concentrate entirely on that area, which would have then given a balance in a certain way to what the Whitney was doing. We wouldn't have called the show, however, the Whitney Counterweight. What we had to take into account was artists from all over the United States who are working, we find, in a whole variety of directions. Now, I don't although there are a few pieces of work in the show that seem conceptual minimal, kind of to us, the broad scope that we found ourselves responsible for incorporated much more than the particular area that you're extremely sympathetic with. And I am also personally sympathetic with that area and, voted for many of those kind of works in the show. But considering the selection committee on a whole, and it took 4 yes votes for someone to get accepted in the show, some of that work is in the show. I think what I hope you're trying to say is that there should have been more of it, but there is some of that work in the show.
What kind of work are you talking about? Strictly, are you talking about realism or something? Or, I'm not talking just about realism necessarily, although I'm a realist, and I guess I would consider Sherrod a realist, but my feeling is that just the work in neither show was probing the basic issues of life, of death, of searching for meaning in life, of making art of great profundity, expressing the human condition, feelings, thoughts, ideas. I see it as a simple, regardless of the different currents. I agree with you. Some people have stretcher bars with a broomstick across it. Some people have 3 or 4 sheets of canvas overlaying each other in a descending line. There's some surrealistic emphasis, fairly tightly painted.
Yes.
But my personal feeling, and please debate this and discuss this, I felt that it simply is, they're all exploring materials and aesthetic manipulation, and they're simply not probing matters of the soul or feeling or anything, regardless of whether they're realistic or not.
I would like to have a chance to answer that.
Sure.
It's true in some cases, what you're saying, but I think there are some pieces in the show which are attempting to deal with those kind of issues. And I think a more careful look at the show will, you will...
On the same level.
That you would...
Same level of concern, if I may interrupt.
Yes, please.
Since I haven't spoken, having been rejected by the Whitney, the Biennale for possibly 17 years, having been rejected by the Counterweight show, it was interesting at the Whitney to find on the first floor, the first room, to have a group of chairs, of which I felt that if it was interesting that, yes, the school of social, political, educational, the viewpoint which would comprise an image, and which I think dominates in the 20th century, which is a very anti-painterly concept for art. I feel like that maybe out of one chair, out of 3 chairs, could have come the group that you had at the Whitney Counterweight. I thought that the Counterweight show was so closely aligned to the state of the same identical values, ethnic values which the Whitney themselves concerned themselves with. In other words, the established side of the slicker, refined state of control within society. I felt the Counterweight was a slightly freer, involving the same values, involving the same approaches to technique within the state of materials, of which Don pointed out. I felt there was no real individualistic type of assertion within the state of media, within the state of a personal painterly voice, within the state of identity as a crisis, as a problem, which I think is more the concern than all of this damn constant referral to materials as an evolutionary participation within almost what I might say egomania type of thing. Now, I'm not angry at you or he because I wasn't in on that show.
What do you mean, ego,
but I feel
I didn't understand.
I think both the hierarchy of the Whitney values of control on the slick side of social values, political, racial, whatever exist, I think has nothing to do with painting. And I think that your particular group picked up the same values, give or take a certain leeway within those that which were not yet established.
Well, Philip,
And I couldn't see any
I
difference.
would like to say something to that, because I think, and I would like to just speak honestly, because I have nothing to defend either. And in a way, the fact that we started out with the Whitney as a reference immediately put certain implications in the situation that we had to deal with, perhaps in the long run, not to our advantage.
But you became subservient eventually within political
issues
and social words.
It did.
And you became the very tool of almost pre-publicizing or further publicizing the Whitney's issue.
Well, wait, let me
disagree strongly
Yeah.
with what you're saying.
Fine.
All right.
I disagree, but I also agree. I believe that we did lose a lot of these values. We lost them for certain reasons.
Yeah, but they were the only thing I want you to say is they were for political reasons,
No,
or for social reasons, and not for painterly reasons.
Those were not the
or
only
art,
reasons,
or
though, because the
possibility of
reasons were partly because of the time in which we put this on, and because of the fact that we were looking at slides. And that's very simple. I mean,
Well,
it doesn't sound like a reason, but it actually
accept
is.
that, but I don't think that's- I don't
I'd
think
like to
that's
talk about that for a little while.
Yeah.
All right, we had 2 months, slightly under 2 months, from the initial conception of the show to install the show and get it operating. We found ourselves under a terrific problem because the only thing finally we could do was look at slides if artists were to send work from all over the United States. With 2 months and no budget, slides were the only thing we could deal with. One of the first things that happens when you look at slides is you tend to lose you see the image pops out at you very clearly, but you miss the painterly quality. And it's almost impossible, even with details of slides, to get that. I spoke when I was on the selection committee time and time again over my dissatisfaction with completely dealing with the whole process in that way, and still try to do the best we can. If it was possible perhaps we would do the show again someday, we would try to get around to more artist studios and so forth. We would really need a little longer time to do it.
See, what I'm wondering about, Bill, I wonder if they're out of town, what percentage of out-of-town artists are represented there? We can get into that. I have a feeling it's New York dominated, just from maybe strictly logistical problems. Huh? Well, just a second. I think maybe a more important point is the fact that, if I can phrase it, I slightly lost my thought, but I think one of the main problems in the 20th century in our time is the dehumanization of people. I believe because of our technology and our mass society that we, the four of us here and everybody out there watching us, are in danger of losing their individuality, are in danger of being dehumanized, of becoming simply a meaningless adjunct to this vast technological society that rolls on without us. Now, the only problem that I see with your art that is being shown at the Whitney and at the Counterweight is that it so graphically demonstrates this process of dehumanization and the destruction of the individual as in part of the image and as part of the individual,
itself, yeah.
the painting, the feeling of an individual expressing himself in the work, and as well as the image of the individual. I think it's absolutely crucial to the history of art of our time, and if we don't realize it, we're simply we're playing aesthetic games. And frankly, that's what I thought was being done in both exhibitions.
All right, now, then I would like to
Same
attempt
belief
to
in
answer you this way. I couldn't agree more with what you're saying
Anything.
about one of the major feelings that welled up in me was this precise thing about technology and the dehumanization and so forth and so on. One of the aspects we tried to bring out in this particular show was this thing of eros. It's really eros versus technology. And even though many of the
Eros as a symbol, and not
As a symbol.
but not as a living entity. That's the
That's
only
right,
problem.
as a symbol. But I think the show does demonstrate a release of the fantasy and of the personal element within people. I think there's a lot of work in the show that has personal, very deep feeling, a lot of very deep conviction. Not all of the work, but some of it certainly has that. Enough to say that it's well represented in the show. If we had more time, it could be better represented, but it is there now.
Phil, did you?
May I ask why the general slant of both shows is seemingly, in fact, I would even support the Whitney, in that maybe I think your show was more abstracted, which is a state of almost dehumanization within materials, and I think the Whitney itself, if I can recall the images that I saw out of both the groups. In other words, I see that it's less of a concern within the state of the individual, and that's what I'm fighting for myself. Explain that to me if supposedly it's more within the state of eros. Because I think of emotion as a human content, and I think that the end product of a work of art, supposedly, has some involvement with it, and I felt the work was cooler at your place, although freer, more unconcerned with almost an attack upon the Whitney, but without replacing it within emotional or eros values.
Well, at this point, I'll just speak for my own particular work. There's plenty of that in my work, and I'm tremendously sympathetic with those kind of goals that you're talking about.
Yours was one of the more humanly concerned within the way you work, yes.
Right. One of the problems was the overwhelming number of things that were sent in reflected a lot of these other values, and these artists also had no chance of ever getting into the Whitney. Very high qualities in their work. Had to be considered.
Okay.
There are a whole variety of ways that people manifest these things.
But all right, yes, but now that's the dilemma of the unconscious state of the individual, if there's such a thing, in that out of the show at the Whitney, you had that room of chairs, and out of those chairs come automatons that reproduce the abstracted values that have been successful, that have been purported as art, that the dollar has turned over for, and I maintain that that's a bunch of garbage, outside the fact that you have followed that verbatim within the choice of your work,
Not so.
more abstracted from any philosophical state of eros, as a symbol or otherwise.
I certainly disagree.
May I ask, did you see all the galleries?
I saw all.
You saw the
Well, the one that was
The Cayman
closed, the
was
one that's closed, we
Well,
could
I'm
not see.
really sorry that you saw
Because
the
it's a
Carmine
Really
gallery.
important gallery.
No, don't tell me that's the hottest thing. Don't tell me that's hotter
No,
than my
but
studio. I won't accept
It
it.
addresses some of these
Pretty hot.
issues that you're
It's
concerned
pretty hot
with
over
more.
there. Really
Within
is.
states of photography and states of
No,
the
painting.
social.
Raw
Painting.
painting over there.
Well, I hope so.
Really,
I hope so.
Ludwig Dottenay.
Then why is it closed?
George McNeil.
Then why is
It
it
was-
closed
they-
today?
they closed-
They closed it down for hotness,
We're
right?
gonna do.
Space of human element.
We're gonna do
They got
something
there
about
late
that.
today. Sorry about that. But there's a tremendous number of artists in the show that reflect that point
Well,
of view.
I hope so. I
They
hope
really
so.
are.
I really
and
hope
There
check
really
it
is.
out.
Mario Romero, who chose that show, thought it was so hot that he just came in during the choosing of the slides that he was going to put in his gallery and just went and took them all. And they're all sitting in his gallery. It's very interesting. That it's a very beautiful show over there.
Yeah.
Very strong.
Yeah, it's very, very strong. Should be
Well,
considered.
I think, art is a question of personal interpretation, and this is where people get into a great deal of difficulty, but I really, truly believe that the longer a person is involved in art, the more years you spend, and with a genuine, honest, deep search for the meaning of life and the meaning of art, I think an individual can easily determine between those artists who are merely scratching the surface, those artists who are simply making shallow manipulations. In other words, the superficial artists versus those artists of significance who have something to say. And I have my own opinion. I personally feel that both shows are very superficial, and they do reflect the human as well as the artistic problems that our time faces. But everyone has to make up their own mind, and certainly I would invite, and I'm sure Bill and Elizabeth as well as Phil would invite the people watching the show to go down to Soho.
Should I mention the
Why
five
don't you
galleries?
mention the 5 galleries? Sure.
All right. The 5 galleries in Soho where the show are is the Auction 393 West Broadway, the James U Gallery at 393 West Broadway, that's on the first and second floor, the K-Mon Gallery at 381 West Broadway, the Rabinovich and Guerra Gallery at 74 Grand Street, and the Ames Gallery. Let's see, the address there is, they're on the corner of Prince and Mercer. Prince and Mercer. So they're all within short walking distance of each other, and they'll be open most of the time.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks to Bill Rabinovich and Elizabeth Converse and Philip Sherrod for coming on the show. And we'll close photographically. Don't close on me, Celia. Would you please close on Philip Sherrod's painting? This is one that was rejected, or the kind of work rejected from the show. And, in my opinion, this is probing issues of feeling and reality that many of the works in either exhibition simply do not concern themselves with. But as we have all said, please go down and judge for yourselves at both places. Thanks very much for watching Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. Have a good day. Was it okay? Did you have a fair enough chance to say what you felt?
Pretty much.